Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. The torches have gone dark. Cornelia Maximila is 27 years old, moving through complete blackness toward a door that opens only once, a door meant only for the condemned. It has not been used in 43 years. She cannot see the steps beneath her feet. She cannot see the stone walls closing in around her. Sight has abandoned her entirely. All she knows are the hands guiding her forward, priests with firm grips on her arms, their breathing calm and controlled, while hers breaks into shallow, panicked gasps that echo off surfaces she cannot see. She is dressed in white. She has always worn white. Since childhood, it has marked her as sacred, untouched, belonging not to any man, but to a goddess. The fabric is thin, useless against the bite of December cold. It offers no warmth, no comfort, no mercy. Her bare feet press against flagstones polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. Though very few of those belonged to women walking this corridor, the smell reaches her first: damp earth, stagnant moisture, and something older, something sealed away from air and sunlight for decades. It is the scent of a tomb, a place built to contain death, not life. Her name is Cornelia Maximila. She has been a Vestal Virgin for 21 years, chosen at the age of 6 from the daughters of Rome's most powerful families. For 2 decades she has tended the sacred flame, a fire believed to protect the empire itself, burning without interruption for over 700 years. Tonight, that fire will not protect her. She has prepared the sacred substances that only vessels are permitted to touch. She has lived in the house of Vestals beside the Roman Forum, surrounded by luxury and reverence, and the constant surveillance of a state that considered her body its most valuable religious asset. Now she is walking toward an underground chamber that has been prepared specifically for her, a chamber that contains a couch, a lamp, a small amount of food and water, and nothing else. A chamber that will be sealed behind her. The entrance buried under tons of earth, leaving no trace that it ever existed. She will not be executed. Execution would spill sacred blood, would pollute the city, would offend the goddess Vesta, whose servant Cornelia has been for 2 decades. Roman law forbids the killing of Vestal Virgins through any direct means. Instead, she will be buried alive. She will be left in darkness with enough provisions to survive for a few days, long enough for death to come through natural means rather than human violence. The legal fiction is that she will die of her own accord, that the goddess will claim her, that no Roman hand will technically end her life. The reality is that she will suffocate slowly as the air runs out, or starve over the course of a week, or go mad in the darkness before either of those fates arrives. The reality is that this is murder dressed in religious language, execution disguised as devotion, horror wrapped in ritual. She reaches the door. She cannot see it, but she feels the shift in air pressure, the subtle change in the echoes of her footsteps. The priests stop walking. One of them speaks intoning words in an archaic Latin that Cornelia barely recognizes despite her years of religious training. The words are a formula, a legal procedure disguised as prayer. They absolve Rome of responsibility for what is about to happen. They transfer Cornelia from the protection of Vesta to the judgment of the underworld gods. They declare her no longer sacred, no longer protected, no longer anything at all. The door opens. Beyond it, Cornelia can see the faint glow of a single lamp, the only light she will have until it burns out, the only companion she will have in the hours or days that remain. She is pushed forward gently but irresistibly. She stumbles over the threshold into a space that is smaller than she expected, a cell barely large enough to contain the couch and the supplies that have been left for her. The ceiling is so low that she cannot stand fully upright. The walls press close on all sides. Behind her, the door begins to close. "I am innocent," she says. The words come out as a whisper, hoarse and broken. "I have never violated my vows. I have never touched any man. I am innocent." The door continues closing. The priests do not respond. Her innocence or guilt is no longer relevant. The trial has been held. The verdict has been rendered. The Pontifex Maximus himself, the Emperor Dion, has declared that Cornelia Maximila violated her sacred virginity and must face the ancient punishment. The evidence against her was a confession extracted under torture from a man she barely knew. The witnesses were slaves who had been promised freedom in exchange for testimony. The trial itself was a formality conducted without defense, without appeal, without any possibility of an outcome other than the one that has brought her here. But none of that matters now. The door closes. The sound of stone meeting stone is final, absolute, the end of everything. She hears earth being poured over the entrance, the muffled thud of soil sealing her in, cutting her off from the world of the living. The lamp flickers, the shadows dance. Cornelia. Maximilla sits down on the couch and begins to wait. She does not know how long she will have to wait. She does not know whether death will come quickly or slowly. She knows only that she is alone, that no one will save her, that her 21 years of perfect service have ended in this underground chamber, where Rome has sent its sacred virgins to die for 7 centuries. And she knows, despite her protests of innocence, that the real reason she is here has nothing to do with violated vows. The real reason is politics. The real reason is power. The real reason is an emperor who needed a spectacle to distract from his failures and chose her as the sacrifice. But that truth will be buried along with her body, hidden from history, along with everything else about the fate of the Vestal Virgins that Rome preferred not to remember. What you are about to learn has been systematically obscured by 2,000 years of scholarship that preferred to focus on Roman virtue rather than Roman horror. The Vestal Virgins appear in textbooks as curiosities, as examples of Roman religious devotion, as footnotes to larger stories about emperors and conquests and political intrigue. What those textbooks do not explain is what actually happened to these women, how they were selected, what their lives contained, and what awaited those who were accused of violating their vows. Tonight you will learn the full truth about Rome's sacred virgins. You will learn how girls as young as 6 were taken from their families and committed to 30 years of enforced celibacy, their bodies becoming property of the state, their sexuality becoming a matter of public religious significance. You will learn what the selection process actually involved, why fathers competed to have their daughters chosen, and what privileges made the Vestal life attractive despite its costs. You will learn about the surveillance system that monitored every moment of a Vestal's existence, the slaves and attendants who watched for any sign of violation, the accusations that could be leveled by anyone with a grudge or an agenda. You will learn why Vestal trials increased during times of political crisis, why emperors found it useful to condemn sacred virgins, what functions these trials served beyond their stated religious purpose. You will learn about the punishment itself, the underground chamber, the ritual burial, the legal fiction that allowed Rome to kill women without technically executing them. You will learn what the archaeological evidence reveals about these chambers, what sources describe about the women who entered them, what happened in the hours and days before death arrived. You will learn about the men who were accused alongside the Vestals, the lovers who supposedly corrupted them, and the very different fate that awaited male defendants. You will learn why some men were beaten to death in public while others were quietly released, and what determined which outcome a man received. You will learn why this system lasted for over 1,000 years, why Rome considered it essential to its survival, and why the punishment for violated virginity was so much more severe than the punishment for almost any other crime in Roman law. Subscribe if you want to understand the darkness at the heart of Rome's most celebrated religious institution. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Because Cornelia Maximilla is sitting in that underground chamber right now, the lamp burning lower with each passing hour, her air growing thinner with each breath, and I am going to tell you exactly how she got there. But before I reveal what happened to Cornelia and the other Vestal Virgins who faced Rome's most horrific punishment, I need to take you back. I need to show you how the system was created, why it functioned the way it did, and what made a small group of women so important that their sexual purity was considered essential to Rome's survival as a civilization. Because you cannot understand what happened to Cornelia without understanding the institution that created her and the men who decided her fate. The Vestal Virgins were among the oldest religious institutions in Roman history, their origins stretching back to the founding of the city itself. According to tradition, Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome, were born to a Vestal Virgin named Rhea Silvia, who was impregnated by the god Mars. This origin story established from the beginning the tension that would define the institution for 1,000 years. The Vestals were sacred precisely because of their virginity, but that virginity was always at risk, always subject to divine or human violation, always a source of anxiety as well as reverence. The historical reality behind the legends is obscure, but the institution itself was ancient and central to Roman religious practice. The Vests tended the sacred flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, a fire that was believed to be essential to Rome's continued existence. If the flame went out, disaster would follow, wars would be lost, plagues would spread, the gods would withdraw their protection. The survival of Rome literally depended on these women keeping a fire burning. This was not metaphor. Romans believed it absolutely. The Vestal flame was the heart of the city, the connection between the human and divine realms, the source of Rome's exceptional destiny among the nations of the world. The women who tended it were not merely religious functionaries. They were the living guarantee of divine favor, their purity, the condition upon which that favor depended. This belief created the framework within which the vessels lived and, when necessary, died. Selection process began with girls between the ages of 6 and 10. They had to be freeborn, with both parents living from families of good reputation. They could have no physical defects, no speech impediments, no impairments of any kind that might suggest divine disfavor. They had to be, in Roman terms, perfect specimens of female childhood. When a vacancy occurred among the 6 Vestals, the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, would select a replacement from among the eligible candidates. In theory, this selection was random, determined by lot from a pool of qualified girls. In practice, it was often the result of political maneuvering, with powerful families competing to have their daughters chosen. Competition was fierce because the benefits were substantial. A Vestal Virgin was freed from her father's legal authority, becoming sui juris, legally independent in a society where women were otherwise always under male control. She could own property, make contracts, dispose of her wealth as she chose. She was supported by the state with a generous stipend. She had the best seats at public entertainments. Her person was so sacred that anyone who harmed her faced execution. She could pardon condemned criminals by simply encountering them on the street. These were extraordinary privileges in a society that otherwise restricted women's legal and social capacity at every turn. A Vestal was in certain respects freer than any other woman in Rome. But this freedom came at a price. From the moment of selection, a girl ceased to belong to her family and began to belong to the goddess. She moved into the house of Vestals, a luxurious complex beside the Roman Forum, where she would live for the next 30 years. She was trained in the rituals and duties of her office by the older Vestals who had preceded her. She learned to tend the sacred flame. To prep are the sacred substances used in rituals throughout the year, to perform the ceremonies that only Vestals could perform. And she learned above all to guard her virginity with absolute vigilance. The term virginity in Roman understanding was not merely physical, but spiritual and legal. A Vestal was not just required to abstain from sexual intercourse. She was required to remain untouched, uncorrupted, unsullied by any intimate contact with men. Even the appearance of impropriety could be dangerous. A Vestal seen speaking privately with a man might face investigation. A Vestal who attended inappropriate entertainments might face criticism. A Vestal whose manner suggested anything less than absolute purity might find herself the subject of rumors that could, under the wrong circumstances, become accusations. The 30 years of service were divided into 3 decades. During the first 10 years, a Vestal learned her duties. During the second 10 years, she performed them. During the third 10 years, she taught younger Vestals and prepared for her eventual release. At the end of 30 years, typically around age 40, a Vestal was freed from her vows and permitted to marry if she chose. In theory, this was a reasonable arrangement. A woman entered as a child, served through her most fertile years, and emerged while still potentially capable of marriage and motherhood. In practice, it was a trap. A 40-year-old woman in Roman society had limited marriage prospects. The skills she had developed were specific to religious service and largely untransferable. The social networks she might have built through family connections had been severed when she was 6 years old. Most Vestals who completed their service remained in or near the house of Vestals, continuing their religious duties unofficially, living on their accumulated wealth, never quite rejoining the society they had been taken from. Children. But completing 30 years of service was itself an achievement. Many Vestals did not live that long, and some Vestals, like Cornelia Maximilla, found their service terminated not by time, but by accusation. The crime of which Cornelia stood accused was incestum, a term that encompassed any sexual violation by a Vestal Virgin. The word literally meant unchastity, but its implications were far broader. Incestum was not merely a personal failing or a religious violation. It was a threat to the Roman state, a pollution that endangered the entire community, a crime so serious that it required extraordinary measures to address. This understanding of violated virginity as public pollution explains much about the punishment that awaited accused vessels. If incestum threatened Rome's relationship with the gods, then the response had to be proportionally severe. A simple execution would not suffice. The violation had to be contained, isolated, removed from contact with the city in ways that prevented the pollution from spreading. Hence the underground chamber. Hence the burial alive. Hence the elaborate ritual that transformed murder into religious ceremony. The procedure was ancient, codified in laws that predated the Republic, maintained through centuries of political change, because the religious logic demanded its preservation. When a Vestal was accused of incestum, the Pontifex Maximus convened a special court composed of priests and religious officials. The accused was brought before this court to answer the charges against her. The trial itself was a religious proceeding rather than a legal one in the ordinary sense. The rules of evidence that applied in secular courts did not apply here. Testimony that would have been inadmissible elsewhere, including statements extracted through torture, could be considered. The accused had limited ability to present a defense. The judges were not bound by precedent or procedure. What the trial was bound by was politics. The Pontifex Maximus, who presided over Vestal trials, was invariably a figure of enormous political power. During the Republic, the position was held by leading senators, who used their religious authority to advance political agendas. During the Empire, the position was held by the emperor himself, combining religious and political authority in a single office. This meant that Vestal trials were never purely religious matters. They were always political events shaped by the interests and conflicts of their moment. An emperor who needed to demonstrate moral authority might pursue Vestal trials aggressively. An emperor who faced criticism for military failures might distract public attention with a spectacular religious scandal. An emperor who wanted to destroy a particular family might target a Vestal connected to that family. The historical record reveals this pattern clearly. Vestal trials clustered during periods of crisis and transition. They increased when emperors felt threatened. They targeted women whose families had fallen from favor or whose connections made them politically useful to destroy. Cornelia Maximilla was caught in exactly this dynamic. The Emperor Domitian came to power in 81 AD after the death of his brother Titus. His reign was marked by military setbacks, economic difficulties, and increasingly paranoid behavior that alienated the senatorial class he depended on for administration. By the late 82nd, Domitian was looking for ways to shore up his authority and demonstrate that the gods still favored Rome despite its troubles. He found an answer in the Vestal Virgins. In 83 AD, Domitian convicted 3 Vestals of incestum. 2 were permitted to choose their own method of death, an unusual mercy that suggested even Domitian recognized the weakness of the cases against them. The 3rd was buried alive according to ancient custom, the first such punishment in decades. But Domitian was not finished. In 89 or 90 AD, he turned his attention to Cornelia Maximilla, the Virgo Maxima, the chief of the Vestals, the most senior and prestigious member of the order. The evidence against Cornelia was thin by any standard. A man named Valerius Lysianus was accused of being her lover, but the evidence against him consisted primarily of his own confession extracted through torture. Slaves were produced who claimed to have witnessed inappropriate behavior, but their testimony was purchased through promises of freedom. No physical evidence existed. No credible witnesses came forward voluntarily. The historian Pliny the Younger, who was present in Rome at the time, recorded that many believed Cornelia was innocent, but belief in her innocence was irrelevant. The Messician had decided that a Vestal trial would serve his purposes, and the chief Vestal was the most spectacular target available. The trial was a formality. Cornelia protested her innocence, calling on Vesta to witness her purity, but her protests were ignored. The verdict was predetermined. The sentence was death by burial. On the day of her execution, Cornelia was dressed in honorary garments and placed in a covered litter so that no one could hear her cries. She was carried through the streets of Rome to the Campus Sceleratus, the field of wickedness, located just inside the Colline Gate. This was the traditional site for the burial of unchaste vessels, a place that had received generations of condemned women. A small chamber had been excavated in the earth, furnished with a couch, a lamp, and minimal provisions. Cornelia was led down a ladder into this chamber, while the Pontifex Maximus Domitian himself performed the rituals that would transfer her from protection of Vesta to the judgment of the underworld. Ply records that Cornelia caught her dress on something as she descended the ladder. When an attendant reached out to help her, she recoiled from his touch, maintaining her purity even at the threshold of death. She seemed more concerned to protect her chastity than her life. Plenty wrote, "The ladder was withdrawn, the entrance was sealed, earth was poured over the chamber until no trace remained." Cornelia Maximilla, who had served Vesta faithfully for 21 years, was left to die alone in the darkness. Now let us return to that chamber where the lamp flickers and the shadows deepen and Cornelia begins to understand the full reality of her situation. The chamber is approximately 10 feet long and 7 feet wide, with a ceiling so low that she cannot stand upright. The couch takes up most of the floor space. Beside it, the provisions that have been left for her: a loaf of bread, a jug of water, a jug of milk, a small amount of oil for the lamp. The quantities are calculated precisely, enough to sustain life for a few days, not enough to extend it indefinitely. The lamp is the most important element. When it goes out, she will be in absolute darkness, cut off from every sensory connection to the world above. The Romans understood the psychology of darkness, the way it erodes sanity, the speed with which isolation destroys the human mind. The lamp is both mercy and torture, a reminder of light that will soon be gone forever. Cornelia sits on the couch and tries to control her breathing. The air already feels close, heavy with moisture from her own exhalation, lacking the freshness of the atmosphere above. She does not know how much air the chamber contains. She does not know whether she will suffocate before she starves. She knows only that death is coming and that there is nothing she can do to prevent it. She thinks, the accusation against her, the man Valerius Lanianus, whom she barely knew. They had spoken perhaps 3 times in her entire life, always in public, always in the presence of others. There had been no relationship, no corruption, no violation. The charges were fabricated entirely, constructed by an emperor who needed a spectacle and chose her as its centerpiece. But protesting innocence accomplishes nothing now. The verdict has been rendered. The sentence has been carried out. Whether she violated her vows or not is a matter of historical record that she can no longer influence. She thinks about the women who preceded her in chambers like this one. The Vestal traditions included stories about some of them, cautionary tales told to young novices to impress upon them the importance of absolute purity. She had heard these stories when she was 6 years old, newly selected, frightened and confused about the life she was being inducted into. She had believed them completely, had internalized the terror of the punishment, had built her entire existence around avoiding the fate that has now claimed her anyway. How many of those earlier women were also innocent? How many were buried alive for political convenience? Religious theater, the satisfaction of emperors who needed victims, she cannot know. The records are silent. The bodies moldered in their underground chambers and left no testimony. She thinks about Vesta, the goddess she has served since childhood. She does not know whether the gods are real. 21 years of religious service have not resolved this question. She has performed the rituals, tended the flame, spoken the prayers, but she has never felt divine presence the way some of her sisters claim to feel it. She has never been certain that anyone was listening. If Vesta is real, if she cares about her servants, why has she permitted this? Why has she allowed an innocent woman to be condemned in her name? Why has she not intervened to protect someone who has served her faithfully for 2 decades? There are no answers. There is only the flickering lamp and the close air and the knowledge that death is approaching. Cornelia begins to pray, not because she believes the prayers will help, but because prayer is what she knows, what she has been trained to do, the only response to crisis that her life has prepared her for. She prays for mercy. She prays for swift death. She prays for justice in whatever afterlife awaits her. She does not pray for rescue. She knows that rescue is impossible. The Vestal system that condemned Cornelia was not static. It evolved over 1,000 years of Roman history, adapting to political changes while maintaining its essential features. The selection of young girls, the requirement of virginity, the severe punishment for violation. Understanding this evolution helps explain why the system persisted so long, and why it took the particular form it did. In the earliest period of Roman history, the religious logic was paramount. The Romans genuinely believed that their city's survival depended on maintaining proper relationships with the gods, and the Vests were central to those relationships. The flame of Vesta represented continuity, the unbroken connection between past and future that made Rome more than a collection of individuals. The virginity of the Vests represented purity, the unsullied condition that the gods required for their worship to be effective. Violation of that virginity threatened everything. If a Vestal was corrupted, the flame she tended was corrupted. If the flame was corrupted, Rome's connection to the divine was compromised. If that connection failed, Rome itself might fall. The logical chain was clear, and the punishment reflected its severity. The burial alive was not arbitrary cruelty. It was a solution to a specific problem: how to eliminate a source of pollution without creating additional pollution through execution. Spilling a Vestal's blood would be as dangerous as the original violation. Leaving her alive would allow the corruption to continue spreading. The only option was to remove her from the community entirely, to seal her away where her pollution could not reach the city. The underground chamber was a form of exile to the underworld. The provisions left with the condemned vessel were offerings to the gods of death, payment for receiving a soul that was being transferred from divine service to divine judgment. The entire procedure was a religious ceremony, not a punishment in the ordinary sense. This religious logic remained operative throughout Roman history. Even emperors who used Vestal trials for political purposes maintained the traditional forms, performed the traditional rituals, preserved the traditional justifications. The system's power derived from its sacred character, and that character had to be maintained even when the system was being abused. But the political dimensions were always present, becoming more prominent as Rome grew more complex. The Republic saw several notable Vestal trials that were clearly politically motivated. In 483 BC, a Vestal named Oppia was buried alive during a period of military crisis, her punishment serving to demonstrate that Rome was addressing whatever divine displeasure had caused its troubles. In 337 BC, a Vestal named Minucia was condemned after being accused based on her taste for elegant dress, a charge that reflected social anxieties more than genuine religious concern. The empire intensified these tendencies. Emperors discovered that Vestal trials served multiple useful functions. They demonstrated imperial piety, showing that the emperor took religious duty seriously. They provided entertainment, giving the public a spectacle that combined religious gravity with sexual scandal. They created opportunities to attack political enemies by targeting Vestals connected to hostile families. Augustus, the first emperor, reformed the Vestal institution as part of his broader program of religious revival. He increased the Vestals' privileges, enhanced their public visibility, and used them as symbols of the traditional values he claimed to be restoring. But he also used accusations against Vestals to target families he wanted to weaken. Later, emperors followed his example. Tiberius investigated Vestals as part of his broader climate of suspicion and accusation. Nero reportedly considered marrying a Vestal a scandal that would have violated every principle the institution represented. Domitian, as we have seen, used Vestal trials systematically as instruments of political control. The pattern was consistent. Emperors who felt insecure pursued Vestal trials aggressively, while emperors who felt confident left the institution alone. The trials were barometers of political anxiety, indicators of imperial uncertainty that scholars have learned to read in the historical record. This political dimension did not make the religious dimension false. Romans genuinely believed in the importance of Vestal purity, but genuine belief could coexist with political manipulation. An emperor could sincerely think that punishing unchaste Vestals protected Rome while simultaneously choosing which Vestals to accuse based on political calculation. The women caught in this system experienced both dimensions simultaneously. They were religious figures whose purity mattered to the community. They were also political targets whose destruction served imperial purposes. Their fates were determined by the intersection of these factors, sacred and secular, religious and political. Cornelia Maximilla was accused because Domitian needed a distraction from his failures, but she was punished because Romans believed that unchaste vessels endangered the city. Both factors were essential. Neither alone would have been sufficient. The men accused alongside Vestals faced a different but related fate. Roman law held that incestum required two participants. A Vestal could not violate her virginity alone. Therefore, whenever a Vestal was accused, a man had to be identified as her partner in corruption. The punishment for male participants was severe death by beating in the forum. Unlike the Vestal's buried death, which maintained the fiction of natural causes, the man's death was public and violent. He was stripped, bound, and beaten with rods until he died, a process that could take hours and that was designed to be witnessed by as many Romans as possible. This punishment served several functions. It punished the man for his role in the violation. It demonstrated that men who corrupted Vestals would face consequences. It provided the public spectacle that Vestal trials were partly intended to create. But the application of this punishment was inconsistent in ways that reveal the political nature of Vestal trials. When Cornelia Maximilla was condemned, 3 men were accused as her supposed lovers. Valerius Licinianus, who had confessed under torture, was not beaten to death. Instead, he was permitted to go into exile, a far lighter punishment that allowed him to retain his life and eventually return to Rome after Domitian's assassination. The other 2 men were apparently released entirely, their names disappearing from the historical record without indication of punishment. This pattern appeared repeatedly. Men connected to powerful families or useful to the emperor often escaped the prescribed punishment. Men without connections, or whom the emperor wanted to destroy, received the full severity of the law. The discrepancy demonstrated that justice was not really the point. Political calculation determined outcomes more reliably than evidence or guilt. The most extreme example occurred during the trial of 113 BC, when 3 vessels were accused and convicted. But the men supposedly involved received contradictory treatment. Some were beaten to death. Others were acquitted, despite similar evidence. The historian Cassius Dio recorded that the verdicts reflected the political allegiances of the accused, rather than their actual involvement. This selectivity must have been apparent to Romans who observed these trials. They could see that some men escaped while others died, that the severity of punishment varied according to factors that had nothing to do with the alleged crime. But the religious framework of the trials provided cover for these inconsistencies. The Pontifex Maximus, guided by divine insight, could distinguish true guilt from false accusation in ways that ordinary mortals could not question. The women had no such escape. Once accused, a Vest's fate was effectively sealed. The religious logic demanded that violated virginity be punished absolutely without the flexibility that political calculation provided for male defendants. Men could be useful to spare. Women were useful only to condemn. The experience of burial was not instantaneous death. The sources describe varying durations of survival from hours to days depending on conditions in the individual chamber. The psychology of this waiting would have been devastating. Alone in darkness after the lamp burned out, surrounded by earth that pressed close on all sides, knowing that no rescue was possible, that the entrance had been sealed, that the world above continued without awareness of her continued existence. Some women reportedly went mad before death aimed them. They screamed until their voices gave out, clawed at the walls until their fingers bled, destroyed themselves through violence born of desperation. Others fell into catatonic states, withdrawing from reality too horrible to face. Others prayed, maintained their composure, met death with the dignity that their training as Vestals had instilled. We cannot know how Cornelia Maximilla faced her final hours. The sources that describe her burial do not describe her death. She simply disappeared, sealed away from the world of the living, her fate known only to the gods she had served, and the emperor who had condemned her. But we can imagine, we can reconstruct from what we know of human psychology and the conditions of the chamber, what those final hours might have contained. The lamp would have burned for perhaps 6 to 8 hours, depending on the oil provided. During this time, Cornelia would have been able to see her surroundings, however grimly. She would have watched the flame flicker and dim, knowing that its extinction would plunge her into absolute darkness. She might have eaten some of the bread, drunk some of the water, or she might have refused, preferring to hasten death rather than prolong it. The psychology of such decisions is complex. Some prisoners in similar situations have reported wanting to maintain control over something, even if that something was only the timing of their own decline. When the lamp finally went out, the darkness would have been total. Not the darkness of a room at night, where eyes adjust and shapes eventually become visible. The darkness of burial where no light exists to adjust to, where the eyes remain useless no matter how long one waits. In this darkness, time would have lost meaning. Minutes and hours would have become indistinguishable. Sleep and waking would have blurred together. The mind, deprived of external input, would have begun generating its own content, visions and voices and sensations that had no correspondence to reality. Cornelia might have seen things, faces from her past, the goddess she had served, the emperor who had condemned her, the man she was accused of taking as a lover, whom she barely knew, whose tortured confession had sealed her fate. She might have heard things, the chanting of the priests who had led her to this place, the voices of her sister Vestals whom she would never see again, her own voice speaking words that made no sense, the babbling of a mind dissolving under conditions it was never designed to face. And eventually she would have died from suffocation as the oxygen depleted, from dehydration as her body consumed its final reserves, from shock as her systems failed under accumulated stress. The exact mechanism would have depended on factors we cannot reconstruct: the size of the chamber, the porosity of the soil, the state of Cornelia's health when she was interred. Death would have been a mercy by the time it arrived. Whatever suffering preceded, it would have made non-existence preferable to continued existence. This was the fate of Rome's sacred virgins when they were judged to have violated their vows. This was the punishment that awaited women who were accused rightly or wrongly of incestum. This was what the civilization that built the Colosseum and the Pantheon considered appropriate treatment for women who were supposed to be the most sacred members of their society. The archaeological evidence for these burials is limited but significant. Excavations in the area of the Campus Scaleratus have revealed several underground chambers that match the descriptions in ancient sources. These chambers are small, consistent with the dimensions described, and show evidence of deliberate construction, followed by filling with earth. The locations correspond to the traditional site for Vestal burials. No human remains have been positively identified as belonging to buried Vestals. The conditions of the burials, combined with centuries of subsequent development in the area, have obscured evidence that might once have existed. But the structural remains confirm that the chambers described in the sources were real, that women were actually buried in them, that the punishment was not merely theoretical. Other archaeological evidence illuminates different aspects of Vestal life. The House of Vestals beside the Roman Forum has been extensively excavated, revealing a luxurious complex that confirms the privileges the Vestals enjoyed during their service. Statues and inscriptions document individual Vestals, their families, their length of service, the honors they received. This evidence creates a strange duocession: the luxury of the House of Vestals alongside the horror of the burial chambers, the honors inscribed in marble alongside the anonymous deaths in underground cells, the public celebration of Vestal virtue alongside the private destruction of women who were accused, justly or not, of violating that virtue. The juxtaposition was not accidental. It was the system working as designed. The privileges existed to make the punishment meaningful. Women who had nothing to lose could not be effectively controlled through threats. Women who had status, wealth, freedom, public honor could be controlled absolutely because they had everything to lose. The Vestal system was a machine for producing compliance through terror. It selected girls too young to consent or resist. It trained them in requirements too demanding to be maintained perfectly. It surrounded them with surveillance that made privacy impossible, and it threatened them with a fate so horrific that no rational person would risk it. Most Vestals never faced the punishment. Most served their 30 years and lived out their lives in comfort. But all of them lived under its shadow, knowing that accusation could come at any time from any source for reasons that might have nothing to do with their actual behavior. This knowledge shaped everything. It shaped how Vestals behaved, how they spoke, whom they associated with, what they allowed themselves to feel. It shaped their inner lives as surely as their outer circumstances. It made them in a very real sense prisoners of a system that called itself sacred. The Vestal system ended, as so much of Roman paganism ended, with the triumph of Christianity. In 394 AD, the Emperor Theodosius I abolished the Vestal Virgins as part of his campaign against traditional Roman religion. The sacred flame was extinguished after burning continuously for over a millennium. The House of Vestals was closed. The women who had served were released from vows that no longer had legal standing. The historical sources do not record what happened to the last Vestals. They simply disappear from the record. their thousand-year institution ending not with burial but with bureaucratic termination. Christian writers celebrated the abolition. They saw the Vestals as relics of paganism, representatives of a religious system that had been superseded by the true faith. They did not mourn the end of the institution, but they also did not examine too closely what the institution had actually been. The horror of the burial chambers did not feature prominently in Christian critiques. The political manipulation of Vestal trials was not analyzed.